Picture this. It's the autumn of 1888. The foggy, gaslit streets of London's East End are about to become the stage for one of history's most terrifying and unsolved murder sprees. But here's the thing. To understand the killer, you first have to understand the place. This wasn't just a backdrop for the crimes. In a way, it was an accomplice. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into. The idea that Whitechapel wasn't just some random location for these horrific murders. It was an active participant. So the real question isn't just who the killer was, it's how. The very environment, the streets, the poverty, the chaos, how it all came together to create his perfect playground. So let's start with the streets themselves. You have to understand this wasn't just any poor neighborhood. It was a uniquely chaotic and dangerous place. A real cauldron of human misery that brewed a perfect storm for crime.
And these were the ingredients for that despair. You had thousands of people crammed into these sprawling slums called rookeries. The streets were a total maze of unlit, unmapped alleys and courtyards, which made them a perfect escape route for any criminal. Sanitation was so bad that disease was everywhere. And underneath it all was this constant, grinding poverty that just wore people down. Now, there were some attempts at reform, like the Peabody estate, but really, it was just a drop in the ocean. The rent was way too high for the people who needed it the most.
So an environment that brutal is obviously going to forge an equally desperate population. Let's take a closer look at who was actually living, or maybe a better word is surviving in this abyss, and see how these insane pressure cooker conditions completely shaped their lives. Whitechapel was basically a magnet for people with nowhere else to go. You had Irish migrants who were fleeing the famine. You had Jewish refugees escaping these violent anti-Semitic riots known as pogroms back in Eastern Europe. And you had this constant churn of temporary dock workers coming and going. What this created was a population that was always in flux, with almost no social safety nets. That just bred instability and, frankly, a lot of mistrust. For a massive chunk of this population, a lodging house like this was what they called home. Just try to imagine it. You pay a few pennies for a different bed every single night. There's zero privacy, zero security. You're just crammed into a room with hundreds of other desperate people. These places were the very definition of social breakdown. And the consequences of all this pressure? Well, they were pretty predictable, right? Society just started to fray at the seams. Sky-high unemployment forced a lot of women into prostitution just to earn enough to eat. Alcoholism was rampant. It was one of the few forms of escape. Violent gangs basically ran the streets with extortion rackets, and all these social tensions often boiled over into anti-Semitic attacks, with the new Jewish immigrants becoming an easy scapegoat for problems that had been there for a very, very long time. So who on earth was supposed to control all this chaos? That job fell to H Division, the local metropolitan police. And as you're about to see, their task was nothing short of impossible. And this right here shows you the huge gap between policing on paper versus policing in the real world. In theory, the beat system sounds pretty logical. An officer walks a set path to be a visible deterrent to crime. Makes sense. But in the labyrinth of Whitechapel, that neat little theory completely fell apart. An officer could turn down one dark alley and be totally alone, completely isolated, and a perfect target. And the public they were supposed to be protecting, a lot of them didn't see the police as allies. They saw them as an occupying force. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the police force itself was really struggling. You know, the quality of recruits often wasn't great, and their authority was constantly being challenged, not just by organized gangs, but by a public that was just plain hostile. They weren't just trying to solve crimes. They were literally fighting for basic control of their own streets. And then, right into this completely broken, overwhelmed system, a new kind of monster appears. The Jack the Ripper murders weren't just a series of crimes. They were the ultimate stress test that would expose every single crack in Whitechapel's foundations. The speed of the killings sent these massive waves of panic through the city. Over just a few short weeks, this autumn of terror saw a brutal escalation, which culminated in the infamous Devil event, 2 women murdered in a single night. You can imagine the pressure on the police became absolutely unbearable. Which, of course, brings us to the most famous question of all. With the eyes of the entire world on London, how did the killer just vanish? Well, the answer isn't about one single mistake. It's about a total systemic collapse. Let's just break down this complete chain of failure. First off, forensic science was barely a thing. Crime scenes were contaminated, and vital clues were literally washed away from the cobblestones.
Second, you had two rival police forces, the Met and the City Police, who were practically tripping over each other and failed to coordinate. Third, the media frenzy was out of control, printing rumors and creating hundreds of false leads that just wasted precious time. And fourth, a group of local businessmen formed their own vigilance committee. They probably meant well, but all they did was interfere and muddy the waters even more.
Okay, so this is where we need to pull back a bit. Step away from the gory headlines for a second. Because to really get this case, we have to analyze what it revealed about the society that created it in the first place.
Let's look at the difference between a surface view and a deep analysis. On the surface, yeah, Whitechapel was a poor area. But a deep analysis shows us how the environment itself, the rookeries and the alleys, actively enabled crime. A surface view lists the problems the police had, but a deep analysis shows why their methods were fundamentally broken and doomed to fail in this specific place. You see, the murders didn't just happen in Whitechapel, they exposed Whitechapel as a catastrophic failure of social care and public safety.
And really, this is the ultimate takeaway. Jack the Ripper was, without a doubt, a terrifying figure. But the real story, the one that lasts, is about the world that allowed him to operate with impunity. These murders held up a mirror to Victorian society, and the reflection it showed was absolutely horrifying. And that leaves us with a huge question that is just as relevant today as it was back in 1888. When poverty, housing, and social tensions create an environment of total chaos, what are the real limits of policing? It's a question Whitechapel forced London to ask, and honestly, it's one we are still trying to answer.